Hi folks, welcome back to the Motorcycle Enquiries. And we're going to have a look today at the problem of evil and whether Augustine's theory suggests that God is to blame to some extent for evil in the world, whether Irenaeus' idea of the veil of soul-making actually justifies evil and the amount of evil that there is in the world. And then we're going to have a look at whether either one of them can really justify evil existing. Okay, so as we enter Thoroton, looking for St Helena's Church, we're going to have a look at some unsatisfactory responses to the problem of evil, including the idea that it's some sort of big plan that we should accept unquestioningly, that it's just a way for humanity to learn from mistakes, that it brings out the best in people. Hello. Or that it's some sort of punishment for humanity. D.Z. Phillips particularly takes objection to these, thinking evil is too serious to just write off this way. So maybe it's a way of deciding our souls, and that was Augustine's idea, the idea that original sin leads to us having to have to essentially pay, and it decides which way our soul goes, whether we're evil or whether we're not, and it's also the cost of freedom. You can't be free without evil. And now this fits in with our experience of the world. You know, free will choices do sometimes lead to suffering. That is true. I'm just gonna go steady here, because the church is just up this way. It also fits the teachings on the fall, the idea that, you know, humanity is actually damaged from the fall. Okay, let's just find somewhere to stop. Okay, and try to... Come on, go out of gear. Come on. British engineering, can't beat it. It's quite a nice little church, this one. It's worth bearing in mind that this is it was actually rebuilt in the Victorian period. That's just a sort of octagonal spire, but it is actually an 11th century church. It's quite a nice little one. It's got some 11th century features inside it, 14th century tower. Yeah, quite pleasant. Back we go. Alright, so spin this around and get back on the go. Ooh. Never a fan of gravel. There we go. So yeah, so basically it fits in with our teachings on the fall and our experience of the world. And that, if you are free, it does mean that you end up suffering for it. And also the idea of privation makes sense. Okay. So the idea that, you know, the lack of good is what evil is. You know, things are bad for different reasons, but they tend to be because they lack goodness. Here we go. So yeah, and that emphasises God's goodness. Anything without God's goodness is evil, and that's a privation of good. So this theodicy therefore is internally consistent. It does make sense all the way through, and it does match up with Augustine's ideas about Genesis 3. However, it does go against the idea of evolution, which suggests that we move towards perfection, not away from it. It also doesn't help if you try to reinterpret Genesis 3. At that point, everything starts to fall down. Also, how did Adam and Eve make the choice to pick the apple, pick the fruit from the tree? Were they already free? And why were they punished for their sins, but we are also punished for their sins? Why do we have to be punished for those sins? Doesn't seem fair. Did God just assume things were going to go wrong? Did he know it was going to happen anyway? That would explain why he created hell and why he didn't make us perfect. Where do we go next? Right, I think we're going to go straight over. Yeah. Okay. And, you know, if we've got a natural inclination towards sin, as Augustine suggests, and, you know, God's electing us based on that, doesn't that suggest that we still lack true freedom? So what's the point in all of this evil and suffering? There's also no real true explanation for natural evil. It's rather poorly explained. You know, there's an idea that God's creation was disrupted. Well, why didn't he fix it? It doesn't give any benefit to the idea of suffering either. Unlike the soul-making theodicy, we don't benefit from suffering. It's just sort of a thing that we have to deal with. And then when it leads to things like like children suffering and babies dying and going to hell, how do we accept that? So really, we have to ask, is God partly to blame for the evil in the world? And you could argue that the privation of good removes the blame from God. God created good, you turn away from it and deprive yourself of good, well then that's your lookout, it's not God's fault. And also, God created all these plans, they got disrupted, that wasn't his fault. Apparently, he's not to blame. However, if God is truly omnipotent, truly benevolent, let's just see what's going on here. Okay, I think we're good. If God's truly omnipotent, then he should be able to change things if he wanted to, unless he's bound by logic, in which case maybe he's not truly omnipotent. And if God's truly benevolent, then he could change the situation. Maybe he doesn't care enough about us. So there are problems with the soul deciding theodicy. There's also the soul-making theodicy, and this followed on from Augustine. This is Irenaeus and later Hick. And it does have some benefits. It overcomes the weaknesses of Augustine, the idea that evil is a tool for good, rather than just being something that we have to deal with. It matches evolution in that we're moving towards perfection rather than away from it. It's a non-literal use of Genesis, also good. Okay, we'll just stop here at the church in Shelton. If I can get it out of gear again, I need to look at that. Okay, so this is St Mary and All Saints. As you can see, it's quite a small church, quite low. This is because it's 13th century and 19th century, but it's from a 13th century design, so it's quite low, it's quite squat. But, nice little church. Anyway, back to where we were. So, this idea matches evolution, the idea of move towards perfection, but also a non-literal use of Genesis. So it's a much more modern theodicy in many ways. It uses the real experiences of suffering in an understandable way, a more modern way. The idea of universalism, which goes with it, that everyone gets to go to heaven, is also compatible, and that means everyone benefits from the suffering that they experience. Also, this idea of developing virtue matches our understanding of real life. You suffer and you learn from it. And it also matches the idea of people like ancient Greeks. Aristotle, for example, was big on developing virtue, that sort of thing. However, instrumentalism is difficult to justify. What about the suffering of animals or the planet? Can animals or the planet learn from its own suffering? Also, why do we need to make poor choices in order to learn? Surely we can learn without making poor choices. What about the imbalance of the distribution of suffering? Why is it some people suffer so much compared to others? Universalism surely removes freedom, because you're always going to get to heaven regardless, so you're not truly free to fail. Does it undermine Jesus' suffering as a result? He suffered for us, but we're all going to go to heaven anyway. And what about those who can't actually learn from suffering? Like babies, for example, when they die. And this is something that D.Z. Phillips, again, made a big point about. So, is evil actually justified by this veil of soul-making? Well, it's hard to say, really, because it sort of explains evil, but does it really justify it? There are still some big problems there. And that then leads us on to this idea of the logical or evidential problem of evil. Most of this has been focused on the logical problem of evil, but the evidential problem of evil... Give me a moment... let's just go straight on here. The evidential problem of evil actually seems to be a bigger issue, because the evidential problem of evil suggests there's far too much for a benevolent God. It's hard to explain. Whereas the logical problem of evil can sort of be explained by whether God is bound by logic or truly omnipotent. So this then brings to the final question. Can monotheism really be defended in the face of evil? It's very difficult. That evidential... Whoa! There's a bit of a jump there. Evidential problem of evil does seem to be a really big one. The logical one's more easy to explain. The evidential one proves more of a problem. And that's one that we're going to have to look at when we look at God's attributes in a later video.